In the last half an hour, the United States has agreed to immediately lift its pause on intelligence sharing with Kyiv and resume security assistance. The announcement came after 8 hours of talks between senior American and Ukrainian officials in Saudi Arabia. In a joint statement, Ukraine backed a US proposal for an immediate 30-day ceasefire, subject to the agreement of Russia. Well, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, told journalists in Jeddah that the ball is now in Russia's court.
It's a terrible war, a costly war, a bloody war, and his number one interest is ending this war once and for all. Today we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation. I want to personally thank, we both want to thank the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, His Majesty, for hosting us, for making this possible. They've been instrumental in this process, and we're very grateful to them for hosting us here today. And hopefully we'll take this offer now to the Russians. And we hope that they'll say yes, to peace. The ball is now in their court. And but again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
Well, just to add to the Secretary's comments, the Ukrainian delegation today made something very clear, that they share President Trump's vision for peace. They share his determination to end the fighting, to end the killing, to end the tragic kind of meat grinder of people and national treasure that's happening on the front in Ukraine. Number one. Number two, they made concrete steps and concrete proposals, not only accepting our proposal for a full ceasefire, which you can see the details of which are in our joint statement that we released together, but we also got into substantive details on how this war is going to permanently end, what type of guarantees they're going to have for their long-term security and prosperity, but also really looking at what it's going to take to finally end this the horrific fighting.
Well, our State Department correspondent Tom Bateman is in Jeddah and gave me his first reaction to the news.
Well, I think there's two really striking things out of this joint statement between the Ukrainians and the Americans. The first is about the proposal for a ceasefire itself, because what we had been hearing in the run-up to these discussions was the idea of a Ukrainian proposition for a limited, partial, early truce that would mean a halt to long-range missile fire and a cessation of hostilities at sea. But what we're seeing in this statement is what's described as an American proposal and something much broader, basically a complete ceasefire to the war, describing it as this: Ukraine expressed its readiness to accept the US proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which could then be extended. But of course the key point is you've only got one side agreeing to that in terms of Ukraine. It has to be taken to the Russians to see if they would sign up to that as well. So that's a critical next step. And the other really important thing in this, of course, is that the United States, it says, will immediately lift the pause on intelligence sharing and resume security assistance to Ukraine. So that was that fundamental moment last week where President Trump ordered a halt to assistance to Ukraine, to, in Mr. Rubio's words, tried to use all the tools at his disposal to get a peace process, as they describe it, going. But that basically meant trying to sort of arm wrench the Ukrainians to get them to the table and do this. And just one other thing in the joint statement that I think is interesting and important is that there's a line about the gratitude of the Ukrainians, talking about the Ukrainian people's strong gratitude to President Trump, the US Congress and the people of the United States for making possible meaningful progress towards peace. Remember that moment in the Oval Office. Remember J.D. Vance saying, "You haven't said thank you." Well, of course, Mr. Zelensky has said thank you dozens and dozens of times to the Americans. That became a moment which symbolise the profound fracture in this relationship, the dressing down of Mr. Zelensky by the Trump administration, his ejection from the White House, and what we're seeing here is a very clear desire by the Ukrainians to try and get that relationship back on track, and they're saying thank you.
And Tom, interestingly, Mr. Rubio also reiterating the fact that, you know, there is no deadline, there's no kind of plan in that sense. The main point, really, of what he wanted to underline was that the shooting stops. He literally said, didn't he, that I just want the shooting to stop and for us to move forward from that point.
Yeah, I mean, remember, President Trump, in terms of his foreign policy, was elected on a pledge to end this war. He said in one day he would do it. He wants to be seen as a deal maker, as a peacemaker. And that's what we're seeing, you know, reflected there by his Secretary of State and his national security advisors, a very strong desire to do that. The problem is, and this is where the Europeans have been very and increasingly vocal over the last week or two, is that what they're really worried about is that by going to the Russians, re-engaging them, normalising diplomatic relations with them, and trying to get a ceasefire before you negotiate a mechanism to enforce it is only going to empower and embolden the Russians. And that's been the big concern of the Ukrainians. If you move towards it, just say, OK, you know, the sort of American arm-wrenching pushes a very quick truce, but without a security guarantee for the Ukrainians. That's what they've always said they feel extremely vulnerable about, because their fear is that Vladimir Putin would simply use that time to rearm, to, you know, reconstitute his forces, perhaps wait a bit of time, a year or two, maybe till after the American midterms, maybe until President Trump has less political capital, and then you have a strengthened Russia, no meaningful way to police a ceasefire, and the European fear is that Vladimir Putin comes back in and tries perhaps to go even further. But we are seeing the American desire to get to, they call it an immediate ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire, very quickly. And it's reported that Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, will travel to Moscow this week for the second time in a month, potentially to meet Vladimir Putin. They want to put all of this now to the Russians and see if they will engage on this process too.
Well, that's Tom Bateman, who is there in Jeddah. He's been covering the talks there. And in the last few moments, we've had some reaction from President Trump through the Reuters news agency. And he has said this. He said, we want to get the Ukraine war over with. He's gone on to say we're going to meet with Russia later on today or tomorrow. And he's also said that hopefully Russia will agree to a ceasefire. And in the last few minutes also we've heard from Ukraine saying that the Ukraine and US have taken an important step towards peace. But President Zelensky saying it's up to the US to convince Russia to agree to a ceasefire. Remember, Marco Rubio very clearly saying to reporters in that press briefing that the ceasefire is about stopping the shooting, but the ball is in the Russians' court, and that he will take this offer to Moscow. And that is one of the main takeaways from this, is will the Russians accept this offer in the same way that the Ukrainians have?